Opening the flank, c4 immediately contests central squares and prepares to build a flexible pawn structure. Opening the diagonal for the queen and bishop, this immediately contests the center and prepares for rapid development. Knight development immediately challenges the center and prepares for castling, increasing white's influence. Boldly seizing central space, this thrust immediately disrupts white's knight and offers a dynamic, if slightly aggressive, game. Knights venture towards the center, contesting central squares and preparing to support a potential pawn advance. Developing a knight here prepares for pawn advances and pressures white's advanced knight, initiating a fight for central space. Doubling pawns on the c-file creates an isolated pawn, a positional weakness black must now manage. Capturing the knight immediately frees black's queen and opens diagonals, but leaves the doubled pawns as a long-term structural concern. Restoring central presence and preparing for pawn advancement, white aims to outmaneuver black's doubled pawns and regain initiative. Developing the knight to its most active square enhances central influence and prepares for pawn breaks. Solidifying the center and preparing development, this maneuver offers white excellent control over key squares. Developing the bishop to a central square opens up diagonals and prepares for castling. Expanding in the center aggressively, white aims to seize the initiative by opening lines and generating attacking chances. Sacrificing the pawn opens a diagonal for your bishop, aiming for kingside pressure and activating your piece play. Opening the bishop aims to eye black's central pawns and prepare for a kingside castling soon. Hoping to develop the queen swiftly, black sacrifices some central influence for a more active queen placement. Unlocking the queenside for piece activity while eyeing black's slightly exposed king. Developing the bishop solidifies the pawn structure and prepares to castle, aiming for king safety and improved piece mobility. Developing the queenside minor piece while preparing to castle and gaining control of the c-file. A bold kingside castling decision, potentially exposing the king to swift central pawn advances and open files. Shifting the bishop to this diagonal strengthens the kingside defense and prepares for potential pawn advances. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm creates an immediate structural imbalance, potentially overextending and weakening black's king shelter. Castling queenside shores up the king amidst the pawn storm brewing on the kingside. A daring pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's queenside structure and gain space, potentially opening lines for attack. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, a necessary prophylactic measure against black's advancing pawns and potential threats. Navigating the tangled pawn structure, the knight seeks outpost potential and escape from the e-pawn's immediate pressure. Shifting the bishop creates a tantalizing fork threat, forcing black to consider immediate material loss rather than developing their position further. Asserting control over the open d-file, the rook prepares to pressure white's compromised center. Exchanging the bishop clarifies the pawn structure and opens the d-file, potentially simplifying into a favorable endgame. The queen's repositioning cleverly aims to exploit the open d-file and potentially create attacking chances against white's uncastled king. Shifting the knight to this square aims to bolster the kingside pawn structure and prepare for a potential central advance. Activating the rook on the 5th rank, aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure, although it might expose the king to increased pressure. This knight maneuvers to a more active outpost, contesting the e6 square and setting up potential threats. The queen embarks on an aggressive sortie, seeking to exploit the exposed king and disrupt white's coordination. Simplifying the position by trading queens removes significant attacking potential from black's side. Reclaiming the queen on e4 solidifies black's central presence, preparing to contest the open files with newfound harmony. Reasserting central influence, the knight now aims to support potential pawn advances or control key squares. Seeking to anchor pawns and prepare a kingside pawn storm, aiming to dislodge the knight and gain space. Reclaiming the central file aims to support the kingside pawn push and prepare for potential pawn breakthroughs. Unleashing the knight to c5 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and open a crucial diagonal for black's pieces. Securing the king's safety becomes paramount as white consolidates the royal position, aiming to weather the storm and prepare for middle-game maneuvers. A strategic pawn advance, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially gain space. Asserting control over the fourth rank with the rook aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially restrict their piece mobility. Unlocking the kingside pawns with a strategic advance, black aims to create immediate counterplay and disrupt white's centralized knight. Stabilizing the knight's position allows for potential maneuvering towards the queenside majority. Pushing the g-pawn creates a dynamic pawn chain, aiming to seize more territory on the kingside and disrupt white's defensive structure. Exchanging rooks simplifies the position, initiating an endgame where black's doubled pawns become a significant weakness. The knight's reinfiltration, a delightful maneuver, immediately ignites tactical possibilities and challenges white's pawn structure. Reasserting central presence, this knight redeployment sets the stage for a pawn advance to challenge black's advanced central pieces. Liberating the knight from its pin and disrupting white's central pawn structure creates dynamic imbalances. Initiating the endgame, the monarch ventures forth, aiming to become an active participant rather than a passive target for pawns. A strategic retreat aims to regroup pieces and prepare for a central pawn push. Unlocking the d-file now, though the pawn sacrifice might invite counterplay along the central open files. Exposing white's king slightly, this forceful check disrupts white's immediate central ambitions. Unearthing the king from its safe harbor now invites a dangerous check, potentially unraveling white's position. Capturing the pawn seizes central space and opens lines for your remaining pieces, potentially leading to an advantageous endgame skirmish. Reclaiming the open file now opens lines for your rook and prepares a decisive endgame initiative. Pushing the pawn forward opens a vital diagonal for the queen and pressures white's isolated central pawn. Unlocking the c-file offers dynamic pressure against black's compromised kingside pawn structure. Opening the queenside flank creates immediate counterplay against white's advanced pawn. Opening the queenside creates immediate pawn confrontation and potential piece activity for both sides on the flanks. Securing the rook's presence on the open queenside file creates vital endgame pressure. The king retreats, seeking shelter from potential pawn advances and opening a subtle line for the rook. Aiding the king's centralization journey to bolster the remaining minor piece's scope. Shifting the king towards the center unlocks potential for pawn advancement and reinforces the pawn chain. Bringing the rook back to the first rank aims to secure the crucial b-file and pressure white's weakened pawn structure. Recapturing the pawn on e1 simplifies the position, initiating an endgame where king activity and central pawn control become paramount for white. The rook repositions, a calculated retreat to contest the central files and prepare for a potential queenside pawn push. King retreat secures stability. The game settles into a passive endgame dance. A repositioning of the rook to a more active file, potentially creating battery pressure along the ranks. Opening the e-file to potentially target black's king is a bold decision, sacrificing some piece coordination. Relocating the rook to the d-file aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially create open lines for piece activity. Reorganizing pieces for a potential kingside pawn push or consolidating central control after the exchanges. Repositioning the rook to challenge the open files now seems like a more promising direction. Bringing the rook to the second rank creates immediate pressure on black's queenside pawns, aiming to pry them open. Establishing a solid pawn shield offers a degree of protection for the king's remaining march. Stabilizing the rook on the edge allows for a potential redeployment to the center, eyeing improved coordination. The rook's repositioning aims to contest the central files and prepare for potential pawn advances. Realigning the rook to the file offers potential breakthroughs through pawn advances. Shifting the rook to the d-file attempts to exploit white's passively placed king. The rook repositions, seeking better placement on the open files, a subtle shift in the endgame's territorial dispute. Repetitive rook maneuvers are draining initiative and sacrificing precious time for black. Doubling rooks on the b-file creates a tempting but potentially vulnerable battery. Shifting the rook to this central square aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create new avenues of attack. Opening the queenside flank creates immediate pressure, aiming to fracture black's pawn structure. The rook retreats, allowing the queen to regroup and defend against potential pawn advances on the queenside. Simplifying the queenside opens up the file for potential long-range pressure. The rook's maneuver to the f-file aims to pressure white's isolated pawn and potentially exploit the exposed king. Reactivating the rook's diagonal opens lines for potential sacrifices or defensive redeployments. Opening the f-file offers a chance to activate the rook, but leaves the queenside pawns vulnerable. This king repositioning aims to exploit the open central files and offers active participation in the endgame proceedings. Reclaiming the d-file is a logical step, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and centralize the rook. Recapturing the pawn on e4 establishes a passed pawn for white and opens lines for active piece play. Unlocking the kingside pawn structure with this check presents a fleeting opportunity for kingside activity. The king now seeks refuge on the second rank, aiming to avoid further complications in the center. The king's journey towards the queenside now offers improved safety and potential for pawn advances. Exposing black's king further, this check aims to disrupt their defensive setup and gain space. Attempting to cram black's pawns together on the queenside relinquishes valuable space and creates structural weaknesses for later exploitation. Repositioning the rook to a more active file, threatening to penetrate black's weakened queenside. Bringing the king closer to the action is crucial for this endgame's activity. Sensing black's rook retreating, the white king now boldly advances, seeking active participation in this unfolding endgame. Consolidating the black king's position offers a slight respite from white's persistent pawn advances. The rook's journey to the sixth rank offers potential support for the queenside advance, aiming to disrupt black's structure. Securing the king's safety on the queenside allows black to consider repositioning pieces for a more active role. A clever maneuver to force the king's hand and simplify towards a favorable rook endgame. King hunts for outposts on the sixth rank, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure. Regrouping the rook to re-establish control of the open central files. The rook's repositioning prepares for a central pawn push, aiming to disrupt white's king safety. Repositioning the bishop to control the important light squares. Unlocking the c-file with the bishop offers a surprise attack on white's pawns and opens new avenues for black's attack. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure offers a measure of safety, preparing for potential kingside play later on. Creating a new passed pawn on the kingside, this pawn push opens up fresh attacking avenues while simultaneously creating weaknesses in black's pawn structure. Reclaiming the open f-file establishes a crucial linchpin for a potential rook lift, aiming to exploit weaknesses around black's king. Unlocking the h-file for infiltration provides crucial attacking potential against white's cramped position. Introducing a bold pawn thrust, seeking to liberate the rook and seize initiative. Exposing your king further by opening the h-file to the pawn takes a significant gamble with your monarch's safety. Capturing the pawn opens the g-file, creating immediate attacking potential against black's vulnerable king. Reclaiming the bishop from its restricted post on b2 allows it to potentially support a pawn advance or reposition for better activity. Reinforcing the bishop on b2 allows white to potentially support a pawn advance or prepare to contest the open c-file. The bishop seeks a more active diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure. The king boldly advances, seeking refuge and potential attacking avenues amidst the pawn structure's chaos. The bishop retreats, offering a brief respite from the relentless attack and preparing to contest the dark squares. Bringing the bishop to g5 adds immediate pressure to the pinned knight on b2, forcing a reaction and potentially disrupting black's defensive setup. Sacrificing the rook for a tempo forces the white king to react, creating a crucial moment in the endgame. Recapturing the knight initiates a crucial rook and pawn endgame where controlling the open files will be paramount. Opening the g-file for decisive pawn promotion while simultaneously clearing a path for the rook to potentially support a breakthrough. Reclaiming the open file offers a renewed chance to pressure black's passive pieces and advance the queenside pawns. Securing the bishop on d4 offers crucial support and defensive options for black's position. Unleashing a pawn storm now risks weakening your king's safety dramatically. Controlling the f-file is paramount for white. Black's bishop now threatens to dominate the diagonal. Opening the h-file with that pawn push creates immediate attacking chances against black's king, demanding a sharp defensive response. The pawn push threatens to entangle the black bishop, potentially creating a mating net around the king. Unleashing the king from its pawn shield initiates a perilous but potentially game-ending march. Pushing the king forward now aims to activate it in the endgame battle, seeking counterplay against white's pawn structure. Reinforcing the pawn chain with the rook offers a vital defensive pawn shield for the king. Pressing the rook back seems like a defensive concession, giving white breathing room to solidify their position. Unleashing a decisive check, the rook forces the black king into a more exposed position, aiming to shatter its defensive structure. Seeking to liberate the blocked rook, black finally endeavors to activate this long-dormant piece from its restrictive square. King's safety is paramount. Now the white monarch can seek refuge from the looming threats. A bold king walk is initiated, seeking respite and potential counterplay in the open territory. The king bravely ventures forward, seeking to join the attack and seize initiative. A desperate attempt to disrupt white's advancing king, but it won't halt the inevitable march toward promotion. The king ventures forth, a bold declaration of intent on the open board, seeking active participation. The king finally seeks refuge on the wing, aiming to escape the prying eyes of the rook. Seizing the open file, this forces the black king onto a square of perpetual exposure. Sacrificing the rook on h7 forces black's king to a slightly more exposed square, setting up a potentially decisive check. Securing the 7th rank offers significant attacking potential and limits black's counterplay. The king now retreats from the dangerous central files, seeking refuge behind its pawn shield. Securing the 8th rank, the rook now targets a crucial invasion point.